We're live now. Okay. Hey, good afternoon. On behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, Chief Executive Officer of Trends Research and Advisory, I'd like to welcome you today to today's session, the latest in Trends Research and Advisory's e-discussion series. And today we will be discussing the Israeli political scene in light of the recent 2021 election. We'll be examining the implications of this election, what it might mean for Israel's political landscape, and what kind of government we are likely to see emerge from the current situation. And also, of course, we'll touch on what the new government, how the new government might take shape, what that means for Israel's foreign policy. And for our discussion today, we have a very, very distinguished lineup of speakers from the Mitvim Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, Israel. We have Dr. Nimrod Goren. We also have Professor Uzi Rabi, the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies in Israel. And joining us from London is Professor Yossi Mechelberg, a senior consulting research fellow of the MENA program at Chatham House in London in the United Kingdom. So I will ask our three speakers to each discuss their ideas and their insights for about 10 minutes each, following which we will go into an open discussion. And I'd like to stress that as the event is underway while we were speaking, those following our event, they're very welcome to send in any questions they might have, and I will try my best to ensure that the questions are considered. I can't promise anything because we normally do get a substantial audience and we receive a lot of questions, but as the moderator, I shall do my best to try and include as many comments and questions as possible, and hopefully we can give good answers to the questions that do arise. So to start with, I'd like to invite Dr. Goren to take 10 minutes to discuss his insights on the Israeli internal political situation in the aftermath of the recent election. Dr. Goren, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure being with you here and at the Mitvim Institute. We very much appreciate the cooperation that we have been developing with Trends over the last few months, and to have the chance to present some insights about Israeli politics and Israeli foreign policy with you. But first of all, to wish you Ramadan Kareem, and maybe a good month ahead for all of you, and a blessed one. In my opening remarks, I will try to present some background and context for our conversation, providing some information, basic information about Israel's governance and political system, relating to developments that took place over the last couple of years, with emphasis on the results of the last elections and possible scenarios, including some elements of foreign policy. I will do that quite briefly because of the time frame, but can elaborate on those and other issues later on in the Q&A. So first, basically, Israel is a parliamentary system. We have a parliament called the Knesset with 120 elected officials there. The system is party-oriented. So each election cycle, parties who run and cross a threshold of 3.25% of the general electorate are admitted into the parliament. And in order to form a coalition to be the prime minister, you need to form a coalition that brings you to the 61 members of Knesset. The elections are supposed to take place every 4 years. In principle, in Israel's history, we saw that elections are happening earlier than that. But what we have been experiencing over the last 2 years with 4 election cycles in a period of 2 years is something that is totally unprecedented in Israel's history. The last election took place late in March. We had 13 parties voted into parliament, with Likud, the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, becoming the largest party with 30 seats out of the 120, and the second largest party is back with 17. Yesh Atid party led by Yair Lapid, an opposition party. So there's quite a gap between the Likud Netanyahu party and his rivals, but that does not mean that we have a decisive vote. So as I will mention later on, we currently are in a position that it's not clear what will be the next Israeli government and who will be the next prime minister and whether we will have a government at all or go for another election cycle. Over the course of these 4 election cycles, I must say that we only once had a government being formed in the spring of last year, kind of a parity government with Likud Netanyahu led, but supposedly one that will lead to a rotation with his contender Benny Gantz later this year in November, should another government not be formed later on. The reason for the crisis, the political crisis that Israel is in, is largely related to the legal situation that Netanyahu is in. Netanyahu is now undergoing court. He's accused of severe charges of bribe and others, and that impacts the political system because that brings a motivation for him to stay in power in a way that will safeguard him from consequences of his trial, and it impacts the attitudes of his political rivals, some of which do not differ from him ideologically, but are not willing to grant him another term in office. So in a way, when we have quite a right-wing dominant parliament with 70 or even close to 80 members of parliament from within the right-wing parties or the ultra-Orthodox religious parties which are affiliated with the right-wing bloc, that bloc that has the majority cannot currently easily form a government because of the personal issues related to Netanyahu and the fact that some of those right-wing parties are not willing to sit within the same government. So if we look ahead after the results of the March election to the process of trying to form a government, eventually we'll have to see what is more dominating our political system. Whether it's the ideological position of the party or whether it's the personal components of those opposing to Netanyahu being in charge. So the elections resulted without a clear decision. No one has currently a bloc of 61. The Israeli President Reuven Rivlin had to give the mandate, gave the chance to one party leader to try and form the government. And after consultations with all party leaders, he chose Netanyahu, not because of close affinity between both, they have some personal rivalry, but because he thought that Netanyahu currently has the best chances, even if not clear at the moment, to form a government. And therefore, currently Netanyahu is in the process of trying to negotiate with potential coalition partners in order to form a coalition, and he has more or less 3 additional weeks to do so before either returning the mandate to the president for him to give it to someone else or asking for a 14-day extension of that, if the president will be willing to give him that. So generally speaking, we have 3 options that we are looking forward to. The one is Netanyahu succeeding in establishing some sort of a government, whether a permanent one or just a short-term government to break the current parity government that is locked in because of the previous elections. Or we have some government that brings together all the actors that are committed to personal change in the prime minister's position. And that will be a government that is very diverse ideologically. It will bring parties from the left to the right, perhaps with the support of some of the Arab members of parliament, or will be strained in deadlock and go to another election cycle later on this year. And within all that context, we have to remember that Israel will also elect a new president in the next couple of months. And that is a calculation that will somehow affect negotiations between the parties because it's some kind of a prize that could be given to one political actor or another to impact their willingness to support Netanyahu or not. Overall, the trend that we can see in the last election cycles is that there is a vast majority for right-wing parties within the Israeli political system, although some of these actors, as I mentioned, are ruling out sitting with Netanyahu in the same government. The last election, we saw the entrance to the parliament of a far-right, really extreme political party supported by Netanyahu, who campaigned for them to pass the threshold. And this, as I see it, is a dangerous development in our political system because these are people who are really on the racist, most extreme side of the Israeli political system. We see a decline in the power of the Israeli political left parties, although that decline managed to be blocked towards the end of the campaign season. There were concerns that left-wing parties will not cross the threshold, but those parties, Labor and Meretz, eventually made it quite okay, but still over time you see the left wing in Israel losing its power losing its dominance in our political system. And you see growing legitimacy of political participation of the Arab parties. So if the Arab population ran to the parliament in a joint list, previously now they were split into two parties with some differences among them, but overall the discourse within the Israeli system, the Israeli public, both on the left and on the right, is more open today to their participation in government than it was in previous election cycles. So in the right wing, you see a split between parties who are deeply loyal to Netanyahu, parties within the right, within his ideological camp that oppose him, and parties that are kind of in between and are checking the waters. Within the Israeli center, you see two parties, Yesh Atid of Lapid, who is a clear rival to Netanyahu, and Kahol Lavan, led by Benny Gantz, currently a coalition partner of Netanyahu, but supposedly not willing to sit with him again, that may be moving towards a Netanyahu government once again if conditions are ripe for that from their perspective, and a left-wing bloc that is clearly on the opposition. Netanyahu is trying to create some sense of emergency to help him in his coalition negotiations. He did it in the past with the coronavirus crisis that kind of helped him convince parties that oppose him to join the government for the sake of national security or national safety. Now he may be trying to do something similar with the tensions arriving with Iran. And that's something that is happening just these days, and we have to look at what's happening between Israel and Iran and how that relates to domestic politics, perhaps a way to convince some political parties that there is a need for some sort of emergency political action to change course on previous election promises. Overall, foreign policy issues were not dominant in the Israeli campaigns, not in these elections and in the previous ones. Issues of corruption, of corona, of economy are much more prominent in shaping the way Israelis vote. Nevertheless, Netanyahu did try to utilize foreign policy issues to the benefit of his campaign, positioning himself as a major statesman with major access and power on the global stage, producing all kinds of events and meetings with global leaders that will boost his image, also trying to visit the UAE, something that eventually did not take place, and is quite in line with similar attempts of his in the past before elections to visit Arab capitals that eventually those visits did not happen because Arab countries are reclined from giving him the stage as part of his election campaign. Netanyahu's rivals criticized him on foreign policy issues, mostly on his way of handling relations with the US. A very clear alignment with Trump and the Republican Party may create problems to Israel now that the Democrats are in power. So political rivals of Netanyahu called for restoring the bipartisan support for Israel in the US. They did call to engage with the US on the Iran issue, on the Iran deal, not to replicate the total rejectionism towards negotiation with Iran that Netanyahu presented in the past. There was some criticism about his tendency to develop alliances within anti-liberal regimes, especially in Europe, but also in the global arena, over Israel's traditional alliance with democratic countries, even if those are critical of our policies towards the Palestinians. And some, especially on the left, were criticizing his policies on the Palestinian issue, not moving forward a two-state solution, but rather taking steps trying to prevent a Palestinian state from emerging. And finally, the Abraham Accords, relations with the UAE, with Bahrain, are quite a consensus from all sides of the political spectrum. People are supporting these agreements, are enthusiastic about the new prospects that they bring, whether for tourism or even for a new image of Israel-Arab relations, a new model of ties that we didn't see with other Arab countries, that is perceived as something very optimistic within the Israeli society and is largely accepted and welcomed by all parties, even if different parties have different framing of how they would like to see these relations emerge. So overall, when we look ahead, we need to combine the political unclarity with the security unclarity currently in Iran, and later on, when and if the government will be formed, it will have quite a number of foreign policy challenges and issues it will have to deal with, from domestically empowering the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which has been weakened over the last few years, to restoring better ties with Jordan, with which Israel currently have tense relations with, to fulfilling the potential of the Abraham Accords, to restoring and reigniting the peace process with the Palestinians, and to rebuilding our relationship with parties in the US and with allies in the European Union. Thank you again for giving me the stage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gorin, and thank you for adhering to the suggested timing so precisely. Thank you so much. I'd like to very quickly now move on to Professor Uzi Rabi, and I invite him to make his comments on the implications of the elections for the internal political landscape in Israel and what sort of government might emerge. Professor Rabi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. It is, as always, a real pleasure to be here with you and just discuss the day-to-day issues and the situation in Israel. Let me wish you all with Ramadan Kareem, and I'll try to keep it short, of course. But you know, I mean, for us in Israel, it is, to say the least, quite unusual to have this rounds of elections, as this is the fourth round in more than a little more than 2 years. This is, of course, unheard of, and what we are trying to do is just to try to find out what happened in this last recent fourth round. Basically, there does not seem to be an ultimate winner, that's for sure. And what there seems to be sort of a continuous deadlock. So stalemate, one way or the other, could be announced as the ultimate winner here. But still, while comparing this fourth round to the previous 3 rounds, I think one can glean, and this is, of course, my observations, some observations to be reckoned with, which to a large extent says that the Israeli political system has undergone kind of a change, and it is high time, even if we are in a deadlock still, it is high time for us actually to name these observations, try to find out whether this is new characteristics of the Israeli political system. So one thing that Nimrod, Dr. Goren, has already mentioned, and he was rightly put it, I mean, this is the power of the, I would say, right wing. I mean, the Israeli right, so to speak, did perform well, maybe very well, at the ballot box, because we do talk about 72 to 77 or 78 seats out of 120 of the parliament, which has been won by, let us say, rightist parties. If I include Israel Beitenu of Avigdor Lieberman, which is kind of questionable, but let's say that close to 2/3 of the seats of the parliament are being basically taken by the right. And of course, what Nimrod said, actually, we have to just remind ourselves that ultra rightist wing, I mean, let us say a Tzionut Datit, which means the religious Zionism, they had strengthened their power too. And this is also one thing we should just mention here. What I think we have to say, or to come with a grain of salt or kind of a reservation, is that there could be some centrist or leftist voters who did sort of a tactic vote here in order to strengthen Gideon Sa'ar or even Lieberman, in order to strengthen the anti-bloc Netanyahu or the anti-Bibi bloc, anti-Netanyahu bloc. This must be said, but if we would like to come up with what we call kind of a bottom line here, I think that in the offing, to see what I would say kind of a prime minister coming from the centrist bloc or the leftist parties, this is far-fetched. I mean, we can say that loud and clear, because what was seen here is that one way or the other, 2/3 of the voters in Israel are tilting to the right one way or the other. And this is something that we have actually to remind ourselves. Of course, there is the Netanyahu phenomenon in the middle of the issue here. And if the fourth round elections, and I think that to a large extent it could be perceived that way, if this is to be perceived as kind of a referendum on Netanyahu's leadership, well, the result is pretty ambiguous because it polarized the political system into pro and anti-Netanyahu blocks, as we have seen that before. Of course, one should mention his legal challenges, so to speak, Netanyahu's legal challenges, trial, and etc. But he still managed to keep a sufficiently solid base of support. And I dare say that this is based on his past performance, and this enabled him to continue to be a prime minister. But as we said before, this may not prove sufficient to form a coalition. The bottom line here is that the very presence of Netanyahu, and one should say that that prevents a formation of a stable wide government. Because if Netanyahu is out of the picture, actually, you can forge a government in no time. That goes without saying. But yet, Netanyahu, in spite of all what we have said before, he still remains a popular base within the Likud, of course, and the right-wing parties. And this has to be actually taken into account too. What I think is the most striking, at least for me, phenomenon or observation in this fourth round of elections is the Arab parties, or one should say the Arab society in Israel. While they lost ground actually due to poor turnout and maybe division amongst their ranks, I think that the very appearance of a party like Ra'am, the United Arab List, led by Mansour Abbas, I think that this is kind of a very, very, in my opinion, instrumental change. Actually, it heralds an instrumental change. Why? Because portions of the Arab society in Israel decided to actually promote civilian agenda at the expense of what one would say nationalistic ideological one. I'm not saying that the Palestinian issue actually is null and void, not at all, in the minds of Arabs in Israel. But basically, the pandemics, all these things that happened in the Middle East and the world at large in the recent decades made, I would say, portions of Arab society in Israel be more focused on what I would call civilian agenda, job opportunities, how we gonna defeat actually those crime issues and disorder here and there, how we gonna better our education and our other sort of socioeconomic issues. I mean, the bottom line here, when it comes to, I mean, I would say that this could be something of a real important significance for Israel, because as I read it, part and parcel of the Arab society in Israel is tilting toward what I would call Israeliness instead of sectarianism. And this is something which is very, very interesting, because it could, one way or the other, bring in sort of a bridge by which Jews and Arabs are working together in building kind of a fresh ethos of Israelism, which fits actually almost everybody. Of course, we have some other groups in the society, but this is actually for other discussion. We have Haredis, we have religious Zionists and all that stuff. But basically, when it comes to what Ra'am, I mean Mansour Abbas is coming up with, is, hey, we have many disagreements. Let's put that aside. Let's talk for the time being about some shared interest. And I also dare say that when it comes to Mansour Abbas' party, they find some similarities with what I would call the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel, Shas and maybe Yahadut Torah. And to some extent, actually, they could see eye to eye here and there. Of course, there are many, many problems still ahead because, as we know, we have the religious Zionists and their basic, rejection of all this move, but all these moves. But I think that we should just take or glean from the fourth round that thing. And of course, if to count on some polls that were made by, I think it was the Israeli Democratic Institute, I think that some amazing findings, like generally speaking, 48% of the Jews in Israel are in favor of including Arab parties in a would-be coalition. 34 from the right, 34%, in comparison to 10% actually a year ago. From the right, Jewish right voters actually said that Arabs can be included. This is something which is very, very interesting. And of course, when it comes to the centrist, 58 or 60% of them actually back the idea, which means that there is a kind of an opening to something which is very, very interesting when it comes to the Israeli political system. And I dare say that if we're going to have another round of elections, which is very, very reasonable, this whole notion of a taboo by which not to include Arab parties in your would-be coalition, well, this has become something which is not as we said before, it is pretty permissible, and we'll have to wait and see actually how things are going to be played. This is one thing that is very important. To conclude, I would say that, all in all, there is a high chance for a fifth round of elections. But if there is a government that is formed by either bloc, it will be a weak and unstable one. This will be, I think, due to what I would call the tactical nature of the formation of a government. So either blocs, whoever is going to come up with a government is aiming at building up something which is pretty artificial, which is aimed at blocking the opposition. We can actually see that, and if there is no fifth round of elections, we might have kind of a weak government. Netanyahu's continued presence in the political system, well, this is, as I said before, something which is undermining our calculus and undermining the formation of a wide, stable government, as we said before. But the Netanyahu issue is still there, and he has kind of a solid base of support, and this is basically what creates the ongoing rounds of elections. And last but not least, I think that the Israeli politics has become far less driven by parties and institutions, and it is more linked to what I would call political personalities and personal leadership. And it remains to be seen if this is this is going to be a permanent feature of Israeli politics. Is this reversible, or there will be a more ideological turn in the near future? Of course, we'll have to wait and see. It remains to be seen. So I'll stop here, and if there would be actually comments, answers, questions, whatever, I will be more than happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ravi. We'll move on immediately to Professor Yossi Mechelberg, who will look at, in contrast to the first two presentations, we'll look at the possible foreign policy implications of the outcome of the election. Professor Mechelberg, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the two previous speakers. And thank you, of course, Renz, for organizing this event and for inviting me. It's really always a privilege, honor to be involved in the institution activity. And let me join my previous speakers in wishing everyone Ramadan Kareem. It's interesting, we are moving to Israel foreign policy, and it was said once that Israel doesn't have foreign policy, only domestic politics. And I think what we heard from what Dr. Gore and Professor Rabi said, I think it reflects to a certain extent that Israel is very much immersed in its own issues, political issues, and domestic one, and for election in 2 years and counting, as we just heard, towards the fifth one, made it very difficult to form a coherent foreign policy. Vacillating between interim governments before, after election, and fractured government over the last year, just waiting for it to terminate its time, again, makes it very difficult to develop not only coherent, but a foreign policy that has strategic outlook. And most of the powers to shape and implement foreign policy has been in the hands of Prime Minister Netanyahu for a long time. He basically, especially in the last year, sidelined Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi. Defense Minister Benny Gantz was also the alternate Prime Minister, just because they belonged to a different party. So there was never a real partnership there when it came not domestic policies, but definitely not when it came to foreign policy. So in this sense, Israeli political scene is also dominated by Netanyahu's corruption trial, which is a major reason why there is no orderly decision-making process, no political stability. And the consequence of this is that it's become almost impossible to discern which of Israeli government policies stem from genuine strategic outlook and which ones are merely to serve Netanyahu's attempt to derail his trial, avert conviction, and possibly stay for as long as possible, as long as he lives in the Prime Minister's office. So what we get is, instead of orderly decision-making through the cabinet, through the foreign ministry, other relevant bodies, they are sidelined, and there is overemphasis on the military security establishment, which can distort the picture, but in the case of Israel, it has been on many occasions actually a restraining force. One Israeli scholar has commented some time ago that the current government also tends to emphasize Netanyahu's rich personal experience in policy shaping and decision-making, thus promoting leadership pattern on personal aggrandizement, which is always dangerous, especially in a democracy. Now, I think, and in a way in line what the two previous speakers said, to understand Israel foreign policy post most recent election, which might lead to another one, it's also important to acknowledge that the outcome of the last election gave a majority to right-wing parties, also the previous election, and it's ranged from softer version to the ultra-right. And I think for the first time we see ultra-rights actually winning 6 seats in the Knesset, which is a dangerous development, which also can affect foreign policy. The only reason that the right-wing government is not formed immediately is because there is a bottleneck in Israeli politics, and this bottleneck is Netanyahu himself, and this is an aspect we should bear in mind. Now, when it comes to foreign policy, there are permanent aspects of Israel foreign policy that are not likely to change significantly under any scenario of a new government, Netanyahu or not Netanyahu. But we might see, depends if there is a government at all, whether it can see more than a year or two of its term, what happened in the trial, we might see some more nuanced changes. And let me very telegraphically look at some major issues that we can expand during the Q&A. Either we look at Israel's strategic positioning, the relation with the US are crucial, diplomatically, militarily, economically, regardless of what administration is in the White House, there are not going to be major changes, at least not in the short run. So obviously, what happened in Washington right now is a sea change compared to what had been taking place in the previous 4 years. I think the lack of change in this relation can be positive, but also a hindrance from US attempting to become a genuine peace broker in the region when it comes to the Palestinian relation with the Palestinians, and also negotiating with Iran. And I think Palestine and Iran, and also Israel causing up to China and Russia, could all put strains on relation with Washington, but give credit to Israel government and to an extent Netanyahu, not necessarily in the way that I would like to see that, but it learned to walk sometimes, even run between the raindrops. So I think this is something we should pay attention to. Israel has somewhat more complex relation with the EU, though the EU is far from being a monolithic organization, and Nimrod mentioned the way that Netanyahu is playing between different parts of the European Union to advance what he sees as Israeli interest, causing up to the more populist nationalist government in the European Union. I think there are close economic scientific relation with the EU, and I dare to say with the former EU country where I'm speaking from. But again, two major issues, Iran and Palestine, are always potential of tension. And as tensions between Iran and Israel mount, as we've seen in the last few days, and Israel is attempting to derail the revival of the JCPOA, it might lead to friction. Moreover, if, as Professor Rabi said, some of the right wing will join the government in the next government, which is a right wing which is hell-bent on expanding settlements, maybe annexation and entrenching the occupation, it's more likely to increase friction between Brussels and Jerusalem. Closer to the region, I think the intrinsic instability of the Israeli political system means that whenever election takes place, it creates anxious anticipation across the Middle East and North Africa, nervousness arising from the vacillations in Israel politics, that its foreign policy derives from the need to lower borders, and as a result, there are constraints on what actually Israel can form as foreign policy. But yes, I think if we look in scanning various possible government and composition of governments or coalition, as far as Israel policies in the regions are concerned, one cannot foresee dramatic changes, whether Netanyahu stays or eventually quits. I think we should accept that the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain, then the agreements with Sudan, Morocco are great achievement, and also developing the informal cooperation with Saudi Arabia. I think while there is peace agreement Egypt and Jordan, there are strains on relations between Israel and Jordan. I think what Israel will try to look is to maintaining this state of affairs. I think the Abraham Accords actually reflects commonality of interest between the Gulf and Israel vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis the economic, diplomatic cooperation, scientific cooperation. But again, the issue of Palestine will linger on. And as for the Palestinian issue, again, for me, it's always fascinating when I look at the election, but something happens just a few minutes away from Israel proper, within the Green Line, how little it actually plays into elections. It's not high of the public agenda. Definitely not top election time. It's almost party, definitely those who try to challenge the government, try to hide this issue and not to confront some of the conventional wisdom involved with that. And it's of course a worry. I can't, this kind of denial leads me to think that under almost any circumstances, a peace process, also considering what happens on the Palestinian issue, the division between the Gaza and the West Bank, the Fatah and the Hamas, it's not very likely there will be major changes. We need to look at the elections in Palestine, if this is going to lead to any changes. But again, the right-wing government can create an extreme right-wing government when it comes to annexation or expanding settlements and changing also the status quo or some of the status quo is changing anyway in Jerusalem, might lead to friction with the international community. And lastly, I would like to look into Iran, and we see the events in the last few days when it's Natanz or in the sea. This is a worrying sign, and it comes more if you heard or listened to what Netanyahu said yesterday. It's moving from more covert operation and plausible deniability into more open friction with Iran, stage by stage. It has to do with what happens in the negotiation in Vienna. It has to do with what happens on the borders in Lebanon, which is another major issue for Israel when it comes to the Hezbollah and the arming of the Hezbollah, the presence of Iran basically on the border between Israel and Syria. So I think all of this creates tense situation that can inadvertently escalate into open hostilities. As I see that I'm reaching the end of the time allocated to me. Another two issues which very succinctly I will refer to, which bothers the Israeli government, is what happens in the ICC in the investigation into war crime and fighting BDS. I think probably the ICC is a more serious issue than the BDS. It's more an ideological movement than a political movement, but I think the ICC is one that should create also a debate within Israel about its relation with the Palestinians, what it lead in relations with the outside world. But as I said, and I conclude with that, I think at least for the time being, Israel will continue to be more immersed in its own domestic political crisis. Some of it will affect its relation with the world, but much of it will be more gradual and incremental change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mettelberger. Lots of very interesting points being made. I think I'll kick off the discussion. I mean, from my own perspective, I'm very interested in, Dr. Goddard mentioned the increase in sort of nationalist, perhaps nativist to a certain extent, political elements and the decline of traditional left-wing parties. And it's to me, it's fascinating how to some extent that mirrors what's happening in the Western world, in UK and Europe. US is different, of course, but of course Trump is seen as very representative of almost like this new right, new nationalist, nativist right. And in the case of Israel, the perhaps emergence is the wrong word, but perhaps sort of expansion of more nationalist groups perhaps further along, political entities further along the right of the political spectrum, and the decline of the traditional left. How might that be explained? If I throw that to anyone on the panel who would care to answer that.
I can say a few words. It's a process that has been going on for a long time. The Israeli left has been dominating the political system during the first decades of Israel's establishment, and then there was a shift to the right. And what happened since mostly the 90s, after the Rabin and the Barak governments, which were the last two left-wing governments that we had, was that the left wing basically tried to resemble the mainstream right when putting its ideas forth to the Israeli general public, joining Likud-led unity government, and not really feeling at ease presenting a clear alternative. And over time, that led to, the dominance of the discourse on the right, leading to the dominance of political votes going to the right, because if the left wing does not present a coherent ideological alternative, why vote for them and not for those that are trying to imitate? And over the last few years, there was a growing centrist bloc within the Israeli system that also attracted many of those that were left in the left, because the centrist bloc was seemingly more of having a potential of promoting leadership change. So there was this ideological decline, plus the growing intention of people on the left to vote for parties who have a better chance of bringing about change, that basically left those left-wing parties much smaller than they can be or used to be.
Well, if I can add just one comment on that too. Well, I think that it has to do with the changing circumstances in the region and beyond. And I do agree that it has to do with worldwide trends, of course. But when it comes to Israel proper, well, I mean, and of course, this is my observation. I think that generally speaking, the left hasn't delivered when it comes to looking at what's going on in the Middle East. I think that the Arab Spring and the last decade made many Israelis actually look at the surroundings. And I mean, you know, visions and scenes like Syria, Yemen, Iraq, etc., and some Arab cries coming from the Middle East were to, you know, make kind of a jumping into conclusions that, well, for the time being, we don't have kind of a way to deal with this whole complex named the Middle East. It is not to be actually issued as kind of a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You have a plethora of conflicts all over the region, and people actually find it very comfortable to assume that the notion of kind of a regional peace and stuff that were bringing or brought in by the left is a little bit far-fetched, actually, regarding the circumstances. It's made people be, you know, kind of a tilt to the center and the right. And of course, when it comes to the political game, one should make sure that we know that when it comes to Netanyahu, for example, as I said, he has his solid base of support. Actually, the right bloc is much more coherent in comparison to the, let's say, center-left, where you have many, many orientations there and these agreements. And this also actually was part of the issue itself. Yes.
If I may just add one point here, maybe two. One, I think the left in Israel never recovered from 1977. And I think also to modernize the left, that it will be fit for welfare society, social democratic state. And there is an issue of leadership, which was very scattered on the left in Israel, couldn't find an alternative leadership. It shifts and vacillates all the time, but actually neglected the bread and butter, which Netanyahu exploited so well. Though his policies don't help, you know, so-called the working class in Israel. It's actually created one of the most unequal societies in the world. But still, this is the very base that Uzi is talking about, is voting, though it probably economically suffers most from Netanyahu's policies. And the left in Israel was to associate with issues that are irrelevant to the daily life of many of the voters. And I think, and without being able to look for alternative leadership, it was in decline. I think I agree with Nimrod that the election or the results looked better than we all expected, but it's actually quite tragic that the left is celebrating with 15 member of Knesset out of 120. If this is the best grade of celebration, it means that the work is there. There is a long, long way towards becoming a governing party or governing bloc.
Is there any sense that the focus on Netanyahu, the controversies, is the sense it's kind of detrimental to the overall political culture? Of course, you know, Israel's a very vibrant, diverse polity, but is it a sort of fear that, you know, I hesitate to use the expression politics as show business, but is it a feeling perhaps there's too much focus on, you know, the focus on the personality detracts from serious consideration of the issues and also the detraction, the ideological stances of the different parties. Anyone on the panel can, if they wish.
Well, I think that we are in a transitional phase. This is why I ended up my presentation with the, kind of a question mark whether Israeli politics has become far less driven by ideological motivations and it totally linked to what I would call political personalities or personal leadership. And I do agree to a large extent to what Yossi said about the, uh, you know, the frictions in the center-left camp, and there was no kind of an agreed and I think dominant person to follow suit or to become a leader, where many actually do accept his leadership. Netanyahu, on the other hand, was fully accepted by the right. I mean, there was no whatsoever actually second thought about his ability to function as the ultimate leader. And of course, when it comes to the right camp, actually people do praise him for the vaccines, do praise him for the Abraham Accords, do praise him for many things, and tend to belittle all these, problems with the what we call actually legal problems Netanyahu is having in tandem with his leadership. So I think that this, what you just asked, is kind of a question that is being left open, whether the Israeli political system is going actually to become kind of a mere political system which is totally linked to personalities, or these parties that we had before with all these ideological, let's say, ideological merchandise, so to speak, whether or not we're going to see that in the future, I don't know. But I think that we are in transitional phase, and this is why I think it is very useful to talk about this fourth round, because we have some new things, and it remains to be seen how actually this all going to be played out by the political parties in Israel.
There is an element of personality cult in Israel, but we have also to, you see, people talk about winning election in Israel. No one wins election in Israel. You're best positioned to form a government. But even Netanyahu didn't get more than 1/4 of the vote. It's solid, but that's about it. And actually, there is decrease in the vote, Netanyahu. Probably without his involvement in what he's facing now in court, he could have been in power for another 10 years because the alternative is not forthcoming. But also, I think we need to acknowledge that Israel's society is a divided society. And between the catch-all parties and basically very sectarian parties, because at the end of it, when we look at the results, there is one party that's 30, the second one 17 MKs, and then you have 11 parties with less than 10 MKs. They represent very specific sectors within the society, and some of them are solid. The Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox, those who represent the settlements, those who represent, okay, sadly they lost a lot of their power, the Israeli Palestinians, or Palestinians Israel, lost a third of their power in this Knesset. But this is by nature part of the divisions within Israel, that they don't move, that it's not flexible enough in order to create massive change. As a result, if there is change, it's very gradual.
And may I just add, definitely the Netanyahu factor brings personality to a very dominant position in the political system. It paralyzes the political system because we see the damage to this over centrality of Netanyahu and his not willingness to leave the system when going to court over bribe charges, like what Ehud Olmert did in the previous decade, how that impacts to the negative our political stability. But what it does, it takes a bit the ideology out of the rest of the political system, which is concentrated on removing him from the stage. And if that happens, you may see a government that is less ideologic, but perhaps better for the Israeli society to try and unite some of the divisions that became much more significant over the last few years. So a government of change, what is called, it brings parties from left and right, may be very good for Israeli society in the short term, enabling the ideological camps to reposition themselves without this Netanyahu cloud hovering above them. So in the longer run, I think it will bring back ideology into the political system, even if at first it will create all kind of unexpected alliances.
Well, we'll wait and see on that, but all of us actually do agree that this political system is not well fit, actually, because when we talk about the stalemate, maybe this is because of the way actually this whole political mechanism of parties and sectarianism is being played out. And I agree with Yossi. If we can take actually the results of the elections, it is basically the symptom of the problem. The problem is the fragmented Israeli society. The results of this round is just a mirror by which to see how fragmented Israeli society is. And on a different scale, we can talk about let's just fix it up and come up with kind of a different method or a system by which to hold the elections. But I agree that this is something that is not mere personalities versus ideology. It's much more complicated, but let's take this as kind of a bottom line. If you would like to have kind of an idea how fragmented Israeli society is, have a look at the results of this fourth round.
And maybe the outcome of this is also two things: the weakening of the democratic system that can be exploited as a result, and also the inability to form foreign policy with clear strategic outlook.
Okay, well, there are several more questions. Unfortunately, the clock is running down on us. We only have a few minutes left. One comment that this is not especially my view, but some would suggest that Israel has a political military security establishment that constitutes a kind of deep state, which ensures considerable policy continuity regardless of who is the leader. Can any of you very briefly comment on that? Is there any truth in that? It's not necessarily my perspective, but it's one I have seen. The deep state will ensure that things pretty much go on as usual, regardless of the politics of coalition building.
I can find some Israelis who would argue that for that too, but I do not accept that. I mean, this deep state thing is a very well taken argument, but I don't think that currently it is fit for Israel. I mean, we could talk about some other Middle Eastern states which could be much more, suitable to that.
Well, I suppose whoever came up with that was thinking specifically of Turkey, perhaps, but that's speculation. So.
This is what I had in mind. Yeah.
When you look at the policies of Netanyahu, you see his government over the years clearly advancing an ideological point of view and an agenda that is very different from the one of previous governments. So saying that there is no differences between left, center, and right in how they operate policy, I think, is misreading how Israel foreign policy and national security issues are being conducted.
It's not, again, I agree with Uzi and Nimrod. It's not about the deep state, but it's also a worrying sign that you have sometimes too many generals in government when the defense minister and the foreign ministers are former chief of staff. Then you have quite a few moving. Again, here in the UK, you hardly see anyone, even a colonel, joining let alone generals joining politics. And there is kind of the flowing from military 2 years and then looking for another star general to take over from Netanyahu. It's also a worry. But
which is a change this election cycle from the previous one, because currently you do not see the generals dominate the political map. Rather, you do not see them almost at all running in political parties.
And the common wisdom is that, generals do not necessarily actually perform well when it comes to politics. And I think that this is the 21st century We need to have some younger guys coming to the fore. We need to have 21st century agenda. And you know, I dare say that when it comes to transitional phase, I mean, many in Israel would argue that all these generals actually do not necessarily become political leaders, because this is a totally different scene. And if to pass a judgment according their actually performance, this is not the best choice actually Israel should make.
Actually, in the last election, there were more media people leading parties than generals.
Yeah. This is the change, I think, yeah, or part of it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a very enjoyable discussion. We've learned a lot from it. Dr. Gorim, Professor Mechelberg, Professor Rabi. Just before we go, I should mention that the next event in Trends' online series is an event under the title of Apps and Digital Platforms, the Threat of Extremist Misuse. And this will be hosted by the Al Ittihad Ramadan Majlis Symposium in partnership with Trends Research and Advisory on Tuesday next week, April the 20th. That will take place at 2 p.m. UAE time, which is GMT +4. But for now, once again, I'd like to offer my sincere, heartfelt thanks to our contributors. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to be talking to you again very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye.